Imagine you're driving home late at night. The roads are empty, your favorite song is playing low on the radio, and you're maybe 2 minutes from your front door. Then, in your rearview mirror, a set of blue lights flickers to life. Your stomach drops, your pulse spikes, and as the officer approaches your window and asks that deceptively simple question, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Your brain scrambles for the right thing to say. Now, most people in that moment will do the same thing. They'll start talking. They'll explain. They'll apologize. They'll offer up a dozen different reasons why whatever just happened was an innocent mistake. And that, right there, is the exact moment they lose the game. Because here's the counterintuitive truth that almost nobody talks about. The smartest drivers on the road answer a police officer's questions with as few words as humanly possible. Not because they have something to hide, not because they're being difficult, but because they understand a legal principle so powerful, so deeply woven into the fabric of the justice system, that it can mean the difference between driving home and spending the night in a holding cell. This changes everything you think you know about traffic stops, and by the end of this video, you'll never hear the phrase, "just be cooperative," the same way again. But before we go any further, I want you to hold on to one question. Why do we feel this intense, almost physical urge to fill the silence when an authority figure is standing over us? It's more than just nerves. There's a psychological trap at work, one that police training actively exploits, and we're going to unravel it piece by piece. But first, let me plant a flag in a real case that still shocks criminal defense attorneys to this day. A man in Ohio was pulled over for a burned-out taillight, a minor equipment violation. He said exactly 7 words outside of handing over his license. 7. And he drove away without so much as a warning. Another driver, same state, same type of stop, said somewhere around 30 words, 3 sentences of polite, cooperative conversation. He ended up arrested, his car searched, and 6 months of his life consumed by a legal nightmare. What was the difference? Why did the man who said less walk free? I'll tell you the exact 7 words later. But first, we need to understand what's really happening the moment those lights go on. Most people believe a traffic stop is a straightforward transaction. You broke a rule, the officer tells you what you did wrong, you accept the ticket or a warning, and everyone moves on. But law enforcement sees it differently. To them, every single traffic stop is an investigation. From the second an officer steps out of their cruiser, they are gathering evidence. Not just about the broken taillight or the rolling stop. They are building a case about you. Your demeanor, your eye movements, the items on your passenger seat, the scent emanating from your window, and most crucially, every single word that comes out of your mouth. Almost nobody talks about this part, but the casual conversation at your window is not casual at all. It's a carefully designed information-gathering sequence, and it works because we've been socially conditioned since childhood to answer when an adult asks us a question. Do you know why I pulled you over? Sounds helpful. It sounds like an opportunity to explain yourself. In reality, it's the most dangerous question you'll ever be asked on the side of the road. And here's where it gets strange. That question is a textbook example of what legal experts call a pre-Miranda, non-custodial inquiry. The officer doesn't need to read you your rights because you are not, technically, in custody. Yet. You are temporarily detained, but free to leave once the stop concludes. The problem is, anything you say during this window is entirely voluntary and completely admissible in court. Every word you speak is evidence. You might think you're just being pleasant, just showing you have nothing to hide. But in the eyes of the law, you are actively building the prosecution's case against you. And the worst part? You might not even know what crime you're being investigated for. The officer doesn't have to tell you the real reason they're asking those questions. A broken taillight stop can very quickly become a drug interdiction, a DUI investigation, or a warrant check, all because of a few words you thought were harmless. So let's get practical for a moment. When that officer asks, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" what should a smart driver say? Well, legal scholars and defense attorneys point to one of the most underutilized rights in the entire Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, the right against self-incrimination. You've heard it 1,000 times in movies. You have the right to remain silent. But there's a catch that no Hollywood script ever gets right. Silence itself is not enough. The Supreme Court has ruled that to actually invoke your right to remain silent, you must do so affirmatively. You must speak up to shut up. The smartest drivers know this, and they use a tiny handful of words to erect an unbreachable legal wall. Something like, "I'm invoking my right to remain silent," or "I do not answer questions." These are complete sentences that stop the information pipeline cold. They are not rude, they are not obstructive, they are a shield. And once you deploy them, any continued interrogation by the officer becomes a potential constitutional violation. That is the power shift nobody talks about. I want you to pause for a second and let that sink in. The moment you clearly invoke your right to silence, the dynamics of the stop invert. You are no longer a subject being passively investigated. You are a rights-bearing citizen who has drawn a line. But this is where the psychological warfare really begins, because police officers are trained to overcome that line without crossing it. They'll say things like, "I'm just trying to figure out what happened here," or, "If you cooperate, I can let you go with a warning." They might even ask follow-up questions that feel impossible not to answer. "Where are you coming from tonight? Have you had anything to drink?" The natural human instinct is to respond, to prove you're one of the good guys. And this is exactly how smart, law-abiding people talk themselves into a jail cell. They're not criminals. They're just unaware that cooperation, in the legal sense, doesn't mean chatting. It means providing your license, registration, and proof of insurance when required by law. Beyond that, every extra word is a liability. Now, let me bring in the story I promised you. The man in Ohio with the burned-out taillight. His name is David, and he'd spent years working as a paralegal before going back to school. He understood the system. When the officer approached and asked the standard opening question, David didn't explain that he'd been meaning to fix the light. He didn't apologize. He didn't say a single voluntary thing. He handed over his documents, and when the officer asked, "Do you know why I stopped you?" David made eye contact and said, "I invoke my right to remain silent." That's 7 words. The officer paused, asked a few more questions about David's destination, and David repeated the same 7 words calmly. The officer eventually walked back to his cruiser, ran the license, returned with a written warning for the taillight, and said, "Have a good night." No search, no field sobriety test, no cascading sequence of incriminating statements. Compare that to the other driver I mentioned. He was pulled over for the exact same equipment violation. But when the officer asked if he knew why he'd been stopped, the man said, "I guess my taillight is out? I'm so sorry, I've been meaning to get that fixed, but work has been crazy, and I was just coming from my friend's place." Harmless, right? Friendly, cooperative. Then the officer said, "Have you had anything to drink tonight, sir?" The driver replied, "Oh, just a beer with dinner a couple hours ago, nothing crazy." 1 beer with dinner. Those 6 words gave the officer reasonable suspicion to begin a DUI investigation. The man was asked to step out. Field sobriety tests were conducted. He performed poorly, as many perfectly sober people do under extreme stress, and he was arrested. His car was impounded. His blood alcohol content later came back at 0.04, well under the legal limit. But the arrest itself, the night in jail, the attorney fees, the 6 months of uncertainty, all of it started because he volunteered information that he was never legally obligated to give. The smart driver who answered with fewer words? He got home in time to watch the late-night news. If you're finding this perspective unsettling, you're not alone. The idea that staying quiet is smarter than being friendly feels counterintuitive to decent people. And that's because we've been raised with a powerful social script. From the time we're children, we're taught that authority figures are there to protect us, and that honesty and cooperation will always work in our favor. And to be clear, honesty is non-negotiable. Never lie to a police officer. Lying can be a crime in itself, obstruction, false statements. But declining to answer is not lying. It's a constitutionally protected choice. The social script, however, doesn't differentiate. It tells you that silence is suspicious, that only guilty people clam up. And this is precisely the lever law enforcement uses to get you talking. They rely on your discomfort with silence. They rely on your need to be liked, to be seen as compliant. This is a psychological phenomenon known as the norm of reciprocity, combined with the authority bias. When someone with a badge and a gun asks us a personal question, our brains interpret silence as a threat to our safety. So we rush to fill the void. We over-explain. And in doing so, we unwittingly hand over the very threads that can be woven into a rope. But the reality is completely different from the social script. The legal script says, You have the right to remain silent, period. And smart drivers internalize that script so deeply that it overrides the emotional urge to explain. They treat a traffic stop like a transaction with a specific, limited purpose. You are required to identify yourself, provide the legally mandated documents, and sign the citation if one is issued. That's it. Anything beyond that is an invitation to an investigation you did not consent to. This is not a theoretical exercise. It's a practical, proven strategy endorsed by defense attorneys across America and the UK, where similar principles apply under the right to silence and protections against self-incrimination. In England and Wales, the caution itself warns, "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." Even there, the emphasis is on strategic silence, speaking only when it serves you, and never filling the air with nervous chatter. Now let's return to that open loop I planted at the beginning. Why do we feel this overwhelming need to speak? The psychology goes deeper than you think. Researchers at Harvard conducted a study on interrogative pressure and found that the human brain registers silence during a high-stakes interaction as a form of social pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same region activated during physical discomfort, lights up when we resist the urge to answer an authority figure's question. This is why staying silent feels so wrong, even when it's legally right. Police interrogators are taught to exploit this neurological response. They create pregnant pauses. They ask open-ended questions and then just wait. And most people, drowning in that silence, will blurt out something, anything, to relieve the pressure. The smart driver recognizes that discomfort as a temporary, harmless sensation. They've trained themselves to sit in the silence, to let the officer fill it, or to simply repeat the magic words that bring the questioning to a halt. And then something unexpected happened when I started sharing this concept with friends and colleagues. I heard story after story of close calls that were diffused by saying less. A woman in Texas was pulled over for speeding late at night. The officer asked where she was headed in such a hurry. Instead of explaining that she was rushing to pick up her daughter from a sleepover where things had gone wrong, she simply said, "I'm exercising my right to remain silent." The officer was visibly irritated but walked away, wrote the speeding ticket, and sent her on her way. Later, a lawyer friend told her that if she had mentioned the sleepover, the officer might have probed further, asked about her emotional state, maybe even found a reason to suspect something more serious, anything to escalate. The less you say, the fewer hooks they have. This is not about disrespecting law enforcement. It's about respecting your own legal boundaries so clearly that you leave no room for accidental missteps. So, what exactly does the ideal, low word count traffic stop look like? Let's walk through an immersive scenario. You're pulled over. You pull to a safe spot, turn off the engine, roll down your window, and place your hands on the steering wheel. When the officer approaches and says, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" you make brief eye contact and say, "I'm invoking my right to remain silent. Here is my license and registration." If you're in the UK, you might say, "I do not wish to answer any questions." Then you hand over the documents. If the officer asks where you're coming from, you repeat, firmly but politely, "I invoke my right to remain silent." No anger, no attitude, just a clear, unbreakable boundary. The officer might press. They might say, "I'm just trying to have a conversation." Your response stays the same. That repetition is not only your legal right, it's a psychological tactic that signals you know the rules of the game. In the vast majority of cases, the officer will complete the stop and move on. You may get a ticket for the original violation, but you will not gift them additional evidence. You will not transform a civil infraction into a criminal investigation with your own words. This changes everything about how you should perceive your daily commute, because the road is one of the few places where ordinary, law-abiding citizens routinely encounter armed agents of the state, and the margin between a routine stop and a life-altering legal battle is often measured in syllables. Every word you say is potential ammunition, and the most brilliant defense attorneys I've spoken to over the years all circle back to the same haunting truth. They have never, not once, seen a client talk their way out of an arrest at the side of the road. They have seen hundreds talk their way into one. The person who says, "I only had 2 drinks," has just admitted to consuming alcohol before driving. The person who says, "I was just reaching for my phone," has confessed to distracted driving. The person who says, "I don't know why you'd smell marijuana in here. I smoked earlier but not in the car," has opened the door to a probable cause search. None of these admissions were required. All of them were volunteered, and every single one of them became the centerpiece of a prosecutor's argument. By now, you might be wondering if this approach makes you look guilty. It's the most common objection I hear, and the answer is something you need to hear clearly. Invoking your constitutional right cannot be used as evidence of guilt in a court of law. The Supreme Court has affirmed this repeatedly. If a case ever went to trial, the prosecution is forbidden from arguing that your silence implies wrongdoing. That's the beauty of the Fifth Amendment. It's a one-way shield. The only people who will try to convince you otherwise are those who benefit from your talking. On the side of the road, an officer might imply that your silence is suspicious. They might even threaten to make things harder for you. But the moment you break and start explaining, you've handed them everything they wanted. Staying silent in the face of that pressure is the single most powerful act of self-protection a driver can perform. Let's pause here for a soft check-in. If you're finding this information valuable, if it's shifting the way you think about interactions with authority, take a moment to drop a comment below. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you said too much during a traffic stop? What happened? Your story could be the very thing that helps another viewer think twice before they speak. I read through the comments regularly, and the collective wisdom in this community is genuinely eye-opening. So share your experience, and while you're there, hit that like button. It's a small thing, but it tells the algorithm to show this information to more people who need to hear it. Now let's open up a layer that most legal guides gloss over. The fewer words principle doesn't end with invoking your right to silence. It extends to every physical action you take during the stop. Smart drivers keep their movements slow, deliberate, and telegraphed. If you need to reach for your glove compartment, you tell the officer first, "My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for it now." Short, declarative, non-negotiable. This accomplishes two things. It reduces the officer's tension, because sudden movements can be misinterpreted as a threat, and it continues the pattern of controlled, minimalist communication. You are demonstrating that you are not a chaotic variable. You're a person who understands the protocol and respects both your own rights and the officer's safety. This is the real meaning of cooperation. Not spilling your life story onto the asphalt, but moving through the transaction with clarity and silence. Almost nobody talks about the fact that police body-worn cameras and dash cams are running. Every single word you utter is being recorded, time-stamped, and potentially reviewed by a prosecutor months later. That friendly chat you think you're having? It's a deposition on asphalt. And the prosecutor isn't watching it with the benefit of your good intentions. They're watching it with a cold, clinical eye for anything they can use. The defendant admitted he was tired. The defendant acknowledged he was speeding. The defendant volunteered that he hadn't slept well. These become exhibits in a courtroom. The smart driver, the one who answered with fewer words, leaves the prosecutor with absolutely nothing but the original citation. That is an asymmetrical advantage that can save you tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and months of psychological torment. And here's where the story escalates one final time. I once spoke with a retired detective who spent 20 years on the force. He told me something that has echoed in my mind ever since. He said, "We were taught that the most dangerous drivers, the ones hiding guns or drugs or warrants, were often the calmest. They were polite, but they gave us nothing. The biggest arrests I ever made came from people who talked too much. The people who said nothing? Half the time we had to let them go because we couldn't build anything." Think about that. The very people the system is designed to catch already understand the power of fewer words. They use it to evade detection. So why would the average law-abiding citizen not use that same power to protect themselves from misunderstanding, overreach, or simple human error? The answer is conditioning. We've been taught that only bad people need lawyers, only guilty people stay silent. That's a myth that has probably ruined more lives than any unjust law. So, as we approach the final stretch, let me tie together the threads of this psychological and legal tapestry. Why do smart drivers answer with fewer words? Because they know that a traffic stop is not a conversation. It's an evidence-gathering operation where you are the subject. They know that every extra word serves as a voluntary waiver of a fundamental constitutional shield. They know that the social script pressuring them to speak is a neurological trap, one that can be disarmed with a simple, calm, repeated phrase. And they know that the real-world consequences of oversharing, arrests, searches, criminal charges, are wildly disproportionate to the fleeting discomfort of staying silent. They're not being difficult, they're being intelligent. They're navigating the system with the same strategic mindset that lawyers use in courtrooms. Now, I want to leave you with a final reflection. The next time you get behind the wheel, I want you to mentally rehearse this scenario. Not to live in fear, but to live in preparedness. Because the moment the blue lights flash, your amygdala hijacks your brain. You won't have time to think critically. You'll fall back on whatever script you've internalized. Make sure it's the script that protects you. The script that says, license, registration, invoke the right, and then silence. That's it. You can be respectful, you can be compliant, but you do not need to be verbose. In fact, verbosity is your enemy. I'll end with this. There's a quote that floats around legal circles, and it's one I think every driver should tape to their sun visor. The most dangerous words in the English language are, "I'm just trying to help." Because on the side of the road, help is not what's being asked for. Information is. And the smartest drivers know exactly what their information is worth, their freedom. Now I want to hear from you directly. What's one thing from this video that you'll carry with you on your next drive? Drop it in the comments. Let's start a conversation that might just keep someone out of a courtroom. And if you believe, like I do, that knowing your rights is the ultimate form of empowerment, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Until next time, drive safe, stay silent, and let the law work for you, not against you.